Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone, and to another episode of Explained. I personally don't like New Year's resolutions. I'd never do them. But if I had to pick one for the channel, it would be to catch up on some of these videos that have been sitting on my backlog spreadsheet for months now. This video is one of them. I kept putting it off because new exciting toys come out, and I'd rather talk about that. But I've been seeing a lot of comments, especially recently, saying along the lines that I'm new to this kind of thing, new to recording and the digital world, or even just setting up a pedal board, and I really don't understand how signal chains work, or what are the basic rules. How do you go about, setting up an amp modeler or a VST signal chain? So that's what we're going to talk about today, is the basics of guitar signal chains. The content of this video is going to be old news for a lot of you guys out there that already dabble in recording guitars, but I would imagine that when you first started out, the term signal chain was a bit scary. And it still can be scary because signal chains can be anything, literally anything. There's no real rules or rhyme or reason a lot of the times for the way that people construct their pedal boards or run them through amplifiers, or especially in the digital modeling world where you can do just about anything. The truth is, though, that 95%, probably more, of rock and metal music will stick to a fairly strict pattern. Even the most insane guitarists don't go too overboard. They may have a lot of different components in their signal chains, but most of the time they're going to follow a pretty strict set of guidelines. There's only been a handful of times that I've personally even split my signal into multiple amplifiers or had the signal recurring back on itself to create some type of feedback loop. But like I said, 95% or more of the time, you can stick to the guidelines I'm going to be talking about in this video to get even a good clean guitar signal or a distorted heavy metal guitar signal. So let's take the simplest amplified guitar signal chain out there. Take an electric guitar, plug your lead in, and plug it into a combo amp. That's a signal chain. It's a very simple signal chain, but it highlights two of the most key elements of any signal chain, and that is the amplifier and the cabinet. If you want the quintessential electric guitar sound, you basically have to go through something resembling an amplifier and a speaker cabinet, whether it be in a head form and an actual cabinet, a combo amplifier, or something that mimics those two in the digital world. While even most novice guitar players realize the importance of the amplifier in your guitar's overall tone, whether it be clean or distorted, very few early on realize that your speaker cabinet definitely matters, whether it be the model of the speaker, especially the configuration, whether it be 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, if you're playing a bass guitar, and especially the construction of the cabinet. You can have a 60s SG, a 50-watt Marshall head, but if you're not going to play it through a 4x12 cabinet, you're never going to sound like Angus Young. There's just nothing that can replicate the sound of a 4x12 cabinet for rock and metal guitar unless you play with impulse responses, which are what mimic it in the digital world. If you want to know more about those, you can watch a separate video. In the confines of this video, though, we're just going to treat impulse responses as the digital analog to the real cabinet. And there is your simplest signal chain, basically, is a guitar through an amplifier and a speaker cabinet. And that will do a lot of sounds that you need, depending on changing up the amplifier model, whether you're on a clean channel, overdriven channel, all that good stuff. You can probably get a lot of rock and, softer genre tones out of just that combination alone. But I know that most of you aren't here to sound like the Beatles. And unless you own one of a select few of amplifiers that can attain a type metal sound on their own, you're probably going to want to own one of these. And it doesn't have to be this specific overdrive, but you will want to own some type of overdrive pedal. It's another quintessential tool in the metal guitar player's toolbox, and can even be really useful for clean stuff as well. Tony Iommi, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Kirk Hammett, Friedrich Thorndahl, all these guys achieved their signature guitar tone with something in the vein of this, whether it be a clean boost or tube screamer, some other type of overdrive solution. There's plenty of them out there on the market now, so just listen to some reviews and choose for yourself, because there's too many pedals nowadays to just recommend one good one. But if you play anything that is halfway overdriven, halfway distorted, you got a decent amplifier, you will want an overdrive pedal for southern rock, for blues, especially for heavy metal. Definitely something every guitar player should have in their signal chain. Even if it's not active at all times, it's nice to have for some much needed chug in your rhythm sound, or a little bit more oomph in your lead sound. There's plenty of other pedals or digital equivalents of that you can throw in front of your amp, including wah pedals, phasers, compressors, fuzz, whole laundry list of stuff I couldn't possibly cover in one video. The important thing to note is that whatever way you order them, when they're all engaged, it's going to have a different effect. If you take a phaser pedal and put it before an overdrive when it's engaged, it's going to sound a little bit different than when you put it after, because it depends if the phase signal is going through distortion or if distortion is going through a phaser. And again, because it's signal chains, there's really not a rule. A lot of people run them differently. It'll sound better to your ears in some applications than others, and that's okay. My preferred setup, without almost any exception, is to throw everything behind the overdrive. That way you get a clean, consistent signal going through the dirtiest part of your signal. So wah pedals, noise gates, compressors, all that kind of good stuff, I usually throw behind my overdrive. And I've shown that time and time again on my AX8 videos. There are certainly exceptions to that rule, and again, you'll just have to use your ear to see if that's what you want to do. But all the stuff you throw in front of your amp, I usually like the overdrive to be last, or fuzz, or clean boost, whatever you're using in that case. Now, if you're still rocking that 15-watt practice amp that came with your first guitar, this video is pretty much over for you. You can't do a whole lot else instead of throwing pedals in front of it, and most of the time if you're playing heavy metal, you're probably going to use a distortion pedal to get your high gain sound, because let's face it, solid state on that, small of an amplifier generally isn't going to sound all that great. However, practically every amp head and most combo amps nowadays include an effects loop, and that allows you to run effects after the preamp of your amplifier. Think of time-based effects like chorus, flanger, delay, or reverb. Something where if you hit a chord, you don't just get a stagnant note. You get something that changes with time. So something like flanger, you get a swooshing sinusoidal wave signal. Something with delay, you might get 3 seconds of echo afterwards. All that stuff is going to change with time. You don't generally want to plug that kind of stuff into the preamp and then let it run through that. You can, and you'll get a different sound than if you plug into the effects loop. Some people prefer that. Guitar players like Zakk Wylde plugs his chorus and phaser, even delay now, right in front of his amplifier. It produces a very different effect than the effects loop, and it's not the effect that most people want. I prefer to run all my time-based effects in the effects loop of an amplifier, not only because it's labeled effects loop, but for the same reason that I prefer to put the wah pedals and the compressors and all that good stuff in front of the overdrive. And that is to keep the signal as defined and as clean as possible, even on an overdriven metal tone. This is kind of the guitar player's equivalent of PEMDAS. Depends on where you throw those parentheses in the equation, and you're going to get a very different answer. And in this case, amp plus reverb does not equal reverb plus amp, because the order definitely matters. And it's really simple. It's because the interaction between the time-based effect and the amplifier is non-linear. And of course, to a certain extent, on some effects, you're not going to be able to tell a big difference, but in other scenarios, you definitely will. It's generally on higher gain amps where you'll really notice that the intended sound is not there when you run time-based effects in front of the preamp. So general rule of thumb, stuff like delays, stuff like reverbs, flangers, chorus, phasers, all that I run in the effects loop because I want my succinct, tight rhythm sound or lead sound, if I'm especially overdriven, going through those effects rather than having a jumbled mess and then trying to cram it through a high gain amplifier and hoping something clean comes out on the other side. Now, all that we just talked about is mono, one sound, all the same things coming out of your one or multiple speakers or simulations thereof. But of course, signal chains don't have to be that simple. You can run them in stereo as well. Of course, in real life, that's a little bit more complicated than the digital world because you have to have a stereo capable cabinet or split into multiple cabinets, multiple heads, use splitters, that sort of thing. But in the digital world, it's a little bit more simple because most of the time they're just going to play in stereo no matter what. And this allows you to use stereo effects. And this is especially handy in the effects loop. So stereo choruses, stereo delays, where you can have different time-based effects going on one side versus the other, can get you some very rich and thick sounds if that's what you're looking for. Still, in the world of mono half stacks, the effects loop is critical to attaining a lot of the tones that you hear from some of your favorite guitar players, which is why I throw stuff like volume pedals to decrease the entire sound of your rig and not just simulate, turning a volume knob, because that's basically what happens when you throw it in front of the preamp of your amplifier. So I put volume pedals there. You can put compressors there if you want another different compressor effect. You can absolutely put noise gates there. Of course, all the time-based delays. So if you draw it out, it actually, again, is not that complicated, at least in the way I use it and the way that a vast majority of guitar players use their signal chains. Now there's one little bit of secret sauce we haven't touched on in this video yet, and that is the power amp section of your amplifier. Whereas the preamp is where 90% of the tone happens, the power amp is what makes your guitar loud. It's where the effects loop runs directly into either in serial or parallel to the preamplifier. It makes it all loud. But there's also a good amount of tone sculpting that happens in the power amp as well. Just like the circuitry of the preamplifier, the power amp construction can significantly alter your guitar tone. And a lot of modern amps include both a depth and presence knob to alter the bottom frequencies and the higher end frequencies a little bit more than your preamp will. Of course, transformers, chokes, the tube type, the interaction between all those elements and your speaker all contribute to your guitar tone significantly, which is why I place so much emphasis on the speaker cabinet, because that interaction is a very large portion of your tone that you can't really mimic anywhere else in your signal chain. The power amp isn't something to worry about too much because it is physically in the same box as the preamp. That's something you really only fiddle with in the digital world unless you want to halfway kill yourself by touching capacitors, and don't mess with any of that. That's not recommended. It's just good to know that that's where the signal flows from the preamp to the power amp. In between's the effects loop, either serial or parallel. So that's about it. Just as a recap, you always need a guitar, you need an amplifier, you need a cabinet in whatever space you're working in, whether it be VSTs, amp modeler, or in the real world. You'll get the rock guitar tone, you'll get most of guitar tones that way. For a vast majority of metal, you will probably need some type of boost pedal like an overdrive or a clean boost to tighten up your guitar before it goes into the amp. There's a myriad of things you can put before and after that in front of the amplifier. And of course, the effects loop is there for your time-based effects like reverbs, choruses, whatever else that you fancy. And there's a lot of guitar players out there that take this basic concept to the absolute extreme, but if you boil it down, most of it follows this formula. They might have a couple different variations of each type of pedal on their board. They'll say, I like this chorus for that song and this chorus for that song, or I use this clean boost in front of this overdrive to tighten that up during a solo, and I'll use this compressor after this clean boost for a clean tappy part. It can get a little ridiculous at times the way they play with the signal chain, but at the end of the day, I would say 99% of guitar players follow this basic formula, and they may play around with what goes where, but it's really not all that complicated once you boil it down. You can get to stereo rigs, you can get into some feedback stuff, which does get a little bit complicated, but for most music out there, this will definitely get you started, and you can venture out a little further when you're more comfortable with it. So I think that about does it for this video. If you have any other suggestions for Explained, please leave them below. And hope you like this one. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.